All right, good evening. We are on the first of the long lines on Chaf Aleph on the Beis. Today we're learning Maseches Menachos Daf Chaf Beis. As you can see, the Amud Beis is very short. We'll be stopping 3 lines from the bottom of Chaf Beis Amud Beis. Today we're going to be dealing at first with a continuation of the sugya of when melach, of when salt is allowed to be utilized by Kohanim, and when it's not me'ilah. And then we're going to switch over to what happens if there are mixtures of menachos. When do we say that they're nisarev, and when do we say that they are not nisarev? So let's get started. Amar le Rav Mordechai le Rav Ashi. Hachi kama Rav Shisha bered Rav Idi. Now, we're in the middle of a sugya. But what's going on over here is that we were discussing, starting at the top of the page, when is it appropriate for a Kohen to have access to salt? And there was a din that we saw from a Mishnah Maseches Shkalim at the top of the page that ala melech ve'ala eitzim sheyuha kohanim ne'osim b'hem. We had this condition that it was allowed, the kohanim were able to benefit from salt. So the Gemara says, yes, that's true, that's what the Mishnah says, but lo nitzurcha ela leben buchri. It only applies to the shita of ben buchri, which we will see in this following Mishnah Ditnan. We have a Mishnah that is also in Maseches Shkalim in the first parak. Amar of Yehuda, Heid ben Bukhri b'Yavne, Kol Kohen sheshokel. Here, shokel is a verb. That's not taking. It means that they gave the machzis hashekel. It's not a syntax. It's not a word, a vocab word we would have used. But every Kohen who gives to the machzis hashekel, eino chote. No aveira for him. Now we know that the Machzis HaShekel was a way that not only were we able to take a census, but it was also a way to fill the coffers of the Beis HaMikdash, to fund the Korbanos Tamid, all the Korbanos that were needed throughout the year. What was the Havamina, that if a Kohen would have given money, would have given the Machzis HaShekel, that it would have been a chet? Because what does he say over here? That the Kohen who gives Machzis HaShekel is Eino Chote. Well, the answer is that if a Kohen is not obligated in giving the Machzis HaShekel, and he does, his coin is Chulin. His coin is not Hektish. No obligation. The only time the money becomes Hektish is if a Yid has a chiyuv to give the Machzis HaShekel. But perhaps the coin has no chiyuv, and therefore the coin that he gives is not Hektish. It is going to be, therefore, instead Chulin. And how does that work? You're going to buy the Korban Tamid with Chulin dollars? No, it has to be bought with Beis HaMikdash Hektish dollars. So comes along the Gemara in the name of Rav Yehuda, in the name of Ben Bukhri, that if a Kohen decides to give the Machzis HaShekel, Eino Chote. Amar lo Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai, Loki, you got the whole thing exactly backwards. Ella, Kol Kohen she Eino Shokel Chote. A Kohen who doesn't give the Machzis HaShekel, he's done an Aver. He has a chiyuv. Ella, why did the Kohanim initially think that they shouldn't have given? Because Kohanim dorshin mikra zele atzman. They made the following drasha. The pasuk says in Vayikra Perek Vav, the Chol Minchas Kohen, all the menachos that are brought by a Kohen, Kolil Tihyeh, Lo Se Achel. They are Kolil, which means that they should be totally consumed by the Mizbeach, Lo Se Achel, and the Kohanim should not eat it. And what svara did the Kohanim give? Hoil ve'omer ushtei halechem ve'lechem haponim shalonu hi heich ne'echolin. You might have thought that the Omer, the Korban Omer that we bring on Tes Zayin Nisan, the second day of Pesach, Ushtei Alechem, which is brought on Shavuos, V'lechem Apanim, the breads that were brought, the showbreads that were brought in the Mizbech and the Heichal Shalanuhi. You might, those we know we're allowed to benefit from those, but you might have thought Heich Nechal, and after all, the pasuk says Kalil, but they are Kulo LaHashem. So says the Gemara that they therefore thought that they were not obligated to give the Machzis HaShekel. Ula ben Bukhri, and according to the sheet of Ben Bukhri, and we're 2 lines from the bottom of Chaf Aleph from the base, according to Ben Bukhri, who says that lechatchila they're not obligated to give the Machzis HaShekel, kimaisi nami chotehu de kama'ayel chul nazara. Hitaka held, unbelievable. Hitaka held that it was usher for them to give the Machzis HaShekel. The Kohanim were not allowed to give it. Why? Because you're not shaykh to that mitzvah. You're the Kohen. You're the practitioner, but you're not the one who actually should be giving. And therefore, had you given, it would have been like bringing chulin la'azara, bring a regular cow, non-hektish cow, and I just pasha walk it into the base of Mikdash and do shchita completely asur. So that's how he held. And says the Gemara, Demaisi, how do we answer up this concern about Ben Bukhri? Demaisi Masar Lehen Letzibor. That really, when they gave it over with a full heart. It wasn't Stam Machzis Shekel. They were mevatel their connection to the money. They weren't giving it as machzis. It was a donation, l'shem donation. In the ATT, we have some donors who give completely anonymously. The only way that they can do that is their money's in a donor advised fund. We can't even send them a tax receipt. We pasha don't know who they are. They've given their money selflessly, no boomerang, no reciprocity, nothing. So the Kohanim, by the way, if you want to do that, just let me know. We're happy to take your gifts. But here the Gemara says, how did the Kohanim give? They were Maisi Masar Lehen Letzibur, total dedication. They gave with no strings attached. And that's how Ben Bukhri was able to finagle, to have the Kohanim give just a good-hearted, a Hartzig Kohen. He was able to give without any strings attached, and it worked out perfectly. Now, salkadai techamina. What might I have thought as we turn to the top of Chav Beis Maralim? Kizachi lehu rachmana. We're tying back to our sugya from yesterday. When is it that we would have thought that that a yid would have access to the melach? Kizachi lehu rachmana liYisrael, and Rashi says lishka limloach korbanim shel hektish liYisrael hu dezachi le. Why is it that we would have thought that that's the case, that Yisrael would have access to the salt? Because top line, Isluhu Lishka, because they were shaykh by the money that was put in the Lishka. The Lishka was a reference to the room or to the containers where the money, where the Machzis HaShekel was put. But the Kohanim, the less Luhu Lishka, by the Kohanim, where it's less Luhu Lishka, where they have no shaykhs to the world of the Lishka, they have no shaykhs to the world of the Machzis HaShekel, Lo Zachi Luhu Rachmana, the salt. I might have thought that. Kamash Malan, that even the Kohanim have access. Okay, good. So now we're going to start a little bit of, it was referenced yesterday, but it's not the Melach Sugya. 3 lines down, Ve'etzim, when it comes to the wood that was used for the pyre, Dipshita Leilatana, de Mishal Tzibur, that by him it was obvious that the Eitzim had a din of Tzibur, like we learned about in a complex price on the bottom of Chaf Aleph Amud Beis. Minalan. From where do we know that this is true? Says the Gemara de Tanya. Yachol, you might have thought, Ha'omer harei alai ola. If a person says that they're committing to bring an ola, you might have thought, Yavi eitzim mitoch beso, derech shemevi nesachem mitoch beso. You might have thought that someone can go into their backyard, chop wood like a woodchuck might do, and kederech shemevi nesachem mitoch beso, that a person should also bring their own wine. I might have thought there's a link. Talmud Lomar, alo eitzim asher laish asher lamizbeach. That's the pasuk that we're all familiar with from Vayikra, Parak Aleph, right in the first parak, first few psukim. I think it's the eighth pasuk. So it says the Gemara, what do we see there? The comparison of al eitzim asher la'ish asher la mizbech. Ma mizbech mishal tzibur af eitzim ve'esh mishal tzibur divi Rabbi Elazar Breb Shimon. So therefore we see a link between the eitzim and the mizbech, and just like the mizbech is shel tzibur, so too is just like the mizbech is, so too the eitzim and the eish. That's Rabbi Elazar Bar Shimon. Then we have another Rabbi Elazar, so we have to keep clarity here. Says the Gemara a quarter of the way down, but Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, not Rabbi Elazar ben Reb Shimon. Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua Omer ma mizbech shelo nishtamish bo hedyot af eitzim ve'eish shelo nishtamish bo hedyot. It can't have been used by a regular person. So therefore, my beinahu. What's the difference between Rabbi Elazar Bar Shimon, who has a perfect comparison of Eitzim to Mizbech, that everything must be Mishal Tzibur, and Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, who says that it can't be used by a hedyo? It says the Gemara, Ika beinayu chadati v'atiki. Says the Gemara, what if it's brand new and what if it's old? So according to the first shita, it has to be brand new. It can even be old. And says the Gemara that Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua was, no, it has to be Shelo Nishtamei Hedjot, it has to be new. Says the Gemara, lo, is it true that you can't use old wood? Vaksiv, we have a pasuk from Sefer Shmuel. The pasuk reads, Yomer Aravna El David Yikach, Vayal Adoni Hamelech Hatov Beinav Re'eh HaBakar La'ola V'Hamoragim U'Klei HaBakar La'etzim. We're allowed to take the moragim. We're going to study what the word moragim means. We'll soon see that it's a piece of wood that was a kli that was used for threshing. And what do we do with that? That can be used for the mizbeach. So you want to tell me that the old wood can't be used, Rabbi Lazar ben Shimon, that that's true? So says the Gemara, it's from this pasuk. How can you say that that's true if this pasuk indicates that that you're allowed to use something even that's old, even the morigan and the clay bakar? You're breaking off a wheel and some of the spokes of the wheel that were made out of wood, and you're going to use them as farmechatesi, that you can't use that. The pasuk seems to say you can. How can you say that the wood that was atiki, the wood that was old, couldn't be used? Says the Gemara, "Hachanami b'chadati." You're right that it's part of a kli, but it was part of a kli that was never used. The chariot just came off the line, the morigim just came off the production line, and it's never been used. Now let's figure this out. Halfway down on Chav Beis Amud Aleph, my Morigan, when the pasuk by Shlomo HaMelech said, by Shmuel, excuse me, when the pasuk by Shmuel said Morigan, what did it mean? Amar Ula, it's a mita shel tarbel. It's a bed, or in this case, a board of tarbel, which is really not helpful because we don't know what any of those words mean. So says the Gemara, my mita shel tarbel. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says it's an Iza de Kurkisa. It's a weight in the shape of an A's of a goat, of a Kurkisa, which was a device that was used to thresh. It was a piece of wood with spikes on the bottom. And it was used to dashabe dashtoy, and it was used to thresh that which needed threshing. So that's what it was. The morigim was a piece of wood, and that was even allowed in the pasuk in Sefer Shmuel. That was allowed to be used for the Mizbeach, as long as it had never been used before, again, within the camp of Rabbi Lazar ben Shimon. Omar Rav Yosef Ma'ikra. What's a pasuk that supports this? The pasuk says, "Hine samticha lemorag charutz chadash bal pipios tadush harim." That the morag was bal pipios. It had some sharpness to it. It had some. I kind of think of it like a bed of nails, except inverted. So they would put it on top of things and they would move it around. It would thresh. It would cut. It would tear. And that was exactly what they wanted. That's how we know that a morag was something that had some sharpness to it. And that brings us to a new Mishnah on Chav Beis Amud Aleph, almost 2/3 of the way down. Nisarev komtza bekometz chaverta. Let's say that you have one kmitza that gets mixed up with the kmitza of another korban mincha. So b'minchas kohanim, b'minchas kohen Mashiach, and b'minchas nesachim, with all of these kinds of korbanos mincha, the halacha is kshera, that it's all kosher. And Rashi here points out, why is it all kosher? Rashi, about 15 lines from the top of the page, Dibur hamaschel b'minchas kohanim kshera, sharikula kalil kemoso, because even if you mix up the kmitzas, the end is the same, which is that the kmitza is going to get burnt on the mizbeach. It's going to be kalil. And because it's going to be kalil, so therefore, even though they're mixed up, we're not worried about the kashrus of that. The end is still the same. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, it depends. When we talk about b'minchas kohen Mashiach and b'minchas nesachim that got mixed up, psula, shezu blilasa ava, v'zu blilasa raka. It really depends, because there are certain kmitzas that if you mix them up, the oil evens out. But in one case, it would be too much oil. In one case, it would be too little. So I'm going to make up ratios. Let's say that one of these korbanos mincha had, 10 ounces of oil. The other one only had 2. So when they're separate, they have the requisite appropriate amounts of oil. But when they've been combined, they even out to 4.5, whatever the average is. And that's too much for one and too little for the other. So Rabbi Yehuda says that doesn't work, because v'hein bolo zumizu, they draw oil from one from the other. It's no longer the distinct and separate menachos. Now the oil has evened out across all the flour, and it's no longer a kosher mincha. So says the Gemara Tanan Hasa, we have a Mishnah over there. This Mishnah is one that we learned before in Maseches Zvachim a long time ago. Dam shenis arev b'mayim. Let's say that you have blood that was mixed with water. Now, if you've ever seen blood in water, it always looks like blood, 10 times out of 10, unless it's the tiniest dot. But let's say you had them mixed. Im yesh bo maristam. If it still has the appearance of blood, the halacha is kosher. What if the blood was nisarev biyayin? What if the blood got mixed with wine? And of course, remember that their wine was a little more viscous and thick than most of our wines. So what's the halacha there? If dam gets mixed up with water, with wine, excuse me, what do we do? So it says the halacha there, roan oso ki'ilu humayim. There we treat it like water. So if you wanted to do zrikas hadam, you're done for. What if there was blood? Nisarev bedam behema o bedam chaya. Rowan oso ki'ilu humayim. You have blood of a korban, you mix it up with another animal, we treat it like water. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ein dam mevatel dam. No. If you have two bloods that are together, there is no such thing as the bloods becoming mevatel to one another. And this is pushing back on the previous case, which is 6 lines from the bottom, the case of Nis'arev bedam behema o bedam chaya. No, we never assume that dam is mevatel dam. We'll discuss the lamdus in the Gemara, and perhaps it's because of what we call min b'mino. Min b'mino is batel, but over here we would say it's not min b'mino. Min b'mino eino batel, is that they don't nullify each other. Let's continue the Mishnah 4 and 3 lines from the bottom of the page. Omar Rabbi Yochanan, ushneim mikra echad darshu. These two shitas, the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda, the Tanakama who says that we do allow for blood to be mevatel, and Rabbi Yehuda who says that we don't. So says the Gemara, it's one pasuk. V'lokach midam hapar midam hasair. You see that when there is blood of a par and blood of a sair, that they're separate language. Hadavar yadua. Everybody knows. Shedamo shel par meruba midamo shel sair. Cows are huge. They have gallons of blood, I presume. I don't know how much. I never checked. But they have a lot. A seir has 1 gallon. Again, I don't know the amount. Don't hold me to it. But they have very different amounts of blood. So says the Gemara, let's analyze this. Rabbanon Sabre, turning to the top of Chav Beis and Beis, that mikan, from the fact that our statement of Rabbi Yochanan indicates midam hapar, the pasuk I should say, indicates different language for midam hapar, midam hasoyer, that mikan la'olen she'ein mevatlin zeh, that even though there is a rove, even though the dam of the par is so much more, we don't care. Ein mevatlin zeh. Rabbi Yehuda Savar mikan. What do we see from here? Lemin b'mino she'eno batel. That when you say these two bloods that are together, that there's no bittul. Now let's analyze. Rabbanon Savre mikan la'olen she'en mevatlin zeh. How can you, the Rabbanon, say that all we're highlighting from here is that there's no bittul? V'dilma mishum demin b'minohu. How do you know that there is simply no bittul? Maybe it's actually a halachic status of min b'mino. So says Rabbi Yehuda, absolutely not. First of the long lines, 4 lines down, and in fact almost done for the day. We'll be stopping 3 lines from the bottom of the page. If you would have given me the language in our Mishnah of min b'mino, v'lo ashmeinan olin, and you wouldn't have given the case of olin, kidduka amris, I would agree with you that it would have been min b'mino. But Hashta, now that the way that it was framed, the Machlokas, Rabbanan, and Rabbi Yehuda, was around the language of the Ashmin and Olin, obviously, because you added in a nuance that wasn't relevant to the phrase of min b'mino, therefore it must be Mishum de Olin that we're focusing on the Aliyah component. And therefore it must be that Olin are not Mevadlin Zezet. Says the Gemara of Dilma ad deika min b'mino ve'olin. Maybe the case was both features, that it's min b'mino and olin, and that taka is a very good question. Kasha against Rabbi Yehuda, against the Rabbanon, excuse me. Says the Gemara, hold on. Rabbi Yehuda savar mikan lemin b'mino she'eno batel. Rabbi Yehuda draws from the pasuk in Chomesh about the dam hapar and the dam hasair, that min b'mino is eno batil, v'delma mishum de olenhu. We're inverting the questions. Maybe it was only because of olin, says the Gemara. Iyashmin and olin, and min b'she'eno mino adika min b'mino ve'olin. Oh, I skipped a line. Iyashmin and olin, min b'she'eno mino kidika amris. I would agree with you if the only way that the case was presented was with the language of Olin and not with the language of Min B'mino. But that's not how the case was framed out when we saw Rav Yochanan's explanation of the Rabbanan and Rav Yochanan, the Rabbanan and Rav Yehuda on the top of this page. Hashta de Ashmin and Min B'mino. Now that we have an implication, and that's in fact one of the things that we see from Rabbi Yehuda, that it's Min B'mino, it must be Mishum de Min B'mino. Says the Gemara, wait 1 second. The Dilma Deika Min B'mino ve'olen. Perhaps we should say that both features were what would be the example of when we should hold that way. It says the Gemara. You're 100% right, Kasha. So therefore, we don't really have a lot of clarity in this machlokes. We'll stop right here, and Yirtzeh Hashem will pick up 3 lines from the bottom tomorrow with this Gemara at Tnan. And one last housekeeping note is that I think Rabbi Robinson's daughter's wedding is Wednesday. So Yirtzeh Hashem will have Daf Yomi at the shiur. I'll provide all of the copies as necessary and post on our chat that that's our game plan. But until tomorrow, Yirtzeh Hashem will see you then. Wishing you all a beautiful night.